There are places in Texas where the earth remembers every drop of blood spilled upon it, where the ground holds grudges longer than any living man, and where the wind carries voices that should have been silenced by time. In 1854, the land west of San Antonio was a brutal expanse of mesquite and stone, a territory so unforgiving that even the Comanche avoided certain valleys, whispering warnings about places where the water spoke with tongues that did not belong to the living. The Spanish conquistadors had passed through these regions centuries before, leaving behind nothing but ruins and cautionary tales written in journals that moldered in Mexican archives, documents filled with references to pozos malditos and aguas que lloran, cursed wells, and waters that wept. The Franciscan missionaries who attempted to establish missions in the area during the 1700s had abandoned their efforts after unexplained deaths and reports of nocturnal voices that called the names of the faithful, drawing them from their beds and into the darkness. These accounts were dismissed as the ravings of men driven mad by isolation and heat, but the missions remained abandoned, their adobe walls crumbling back into the earth that had never wanted them there in the first place. This is the account of what happened at Stillwater Creek, a settlement that existed for only 11 days before it was abandoned to the dust and the silence, a story preserved in a single journal found years later in a burned wagon, its pages stained with substances that were not entirely ink. The journal belonged to Samuel Bridger, a surveyor from Missouri who arrived in Texas with promises of land grants and the dream of building something permanent in a country that seemed to resist all permanence. He was 32 years old, a man who had seen the elephant in the Mexican War and thought himself hardened against fear, a practical man who believed in measurements and boundaries and the solid truth of what could be touched and quantified. He had lost his wife to cholera during the crossing from Missouri, had buried her beside a nameless creek in Indian Territory, had read the 23rd Psalm over a grave marked with stones that would be scattered by the next spring flood. That loss had carved something hollow from his center, had left him with the need to build, to create, to impose order on chaos as a way of fighting back against the randomness of death and the indifference of the universe. He came to the valley with 17 others, families mostly, people who had sold everything they owned for the chance to claim land under the Peters Colony Grant, people who had crossed half a continent with their children and their few possessions loaded onto wagons that creaked like dying animals across the endless prairie. Among them was Thomas Patterson, the man who would become the first to die, a carpenter from Kentucky with hands scarred from years of working wood, a quiet man who spoke little but whose work was solid and true. His wife Martha was pregnant with their fourth child, her belly swollen beneath her calico dress as she walked beside their wagon to spare the horses. Their 3 children, 2 boys and a girl ranging from 5 to 11 years old, had the stunned look of young ones who had traveled too far and seen too much, their eyes holding the knowledge that safety was a fiction and that parents could not always protect them from what waited in the darkness. There was Dutch Hoffman and his young bride Sarah, married less than a year, still in that stage where they could not bear to be apart, where their hands found each other constantly as though physical contact was necessary to confirm the other's existence. Dutch had bought his land site unseen, trusting in the promises of speculators and the dream of establishing a farm where his descendants might live for generations. Sarah kept a diary in which she wrote poems, clumsy verses about wildflowers and new beginnings, words that would end abruptly after only 5 entries, the rest of the pages remaining blank forever. Jacob Turney, the blacksmith, carried his anvil in his wagon, that essential tool of frontier survival, along with hammers and tongs and iron stock that would be transformed into the nails and hinges and hardware that a new settlement required. He was a giant of a man, 6.5 feet tall with shoulders that seemed built for bearing impossible weights, and he believed absolutely in the gospel of work, in the idea that any problem could be solved through sufficient application of sweat and will. Margaret Boone was a widow who had come west with her grown son James, driven by the need to escape a Kentucky farm that held too many memories of the husband she had lost to a mule's kick 3 years prior. She read her Bible every evening and believed that God tested his faithful with trials, that suffering was a refining fire meant to burn away impurity and leave only what was essential and true. Her faith would be tested in ways she could never have imagined, would be strained beyond the breaking point in the days to come. The valley they chose seemed blessed at first. Stillwater Creek ran clear and cold from a spring that bubbled up from limestone formations, the water sweet and abundant even in the dry season. The creek bed was lined with smooth stones worn round by centuries of flow, and cottonwood trees grew along its banks, their leaves whispering in the constant wind that blew across the plains. Deer trails crossed and recrossed the valley, and they saw evidence of wild turkey and javelina, signs that game was plentiful. The soil was rich where the creek flooded each spring, dark loam mixed with the red clay that characterized the region, and the men dug test holes that showed good depth before hitting the caliche hardpan that made farming in Texas such brutal work. There were 3 old wells already dug when they arrived, stone-lined shafts that dropped deep into the earth, their origins unknown. The structures around the wells were long gone, just scattered foundation stones and the rusted remains of chains and buckets. But the wells themselves were sound, their water pure and cold, drawn from the same limestone aquifer that fed the creek. The stonework was remarkable, each well constructed with carefully fitted limestone blocks that showed the work of skilled masons, work that must have taken months to complete. Samuel examined the wells with professional interest, noting the precision of the construction, the way the stones were shaped to interlock without mortar, the technique suggesting Mexican or possibly even Spanish colonial origin. But there were no other signs of habitation, no pottery shards or tool marks or grave sites, nothing to indicate who had built the wells or why they had abandoned them. The absence of evidence troubled him in a way he could not articulate, a sense that something was deliberately missing, that history had been erased rather than simply forgotten. That first night they camped beside the creek, the families gathering around fires built from mesquite wood that burned with a sweet smoke that kept mosquitoes at bay. The children played in the shallows while the women prepared meals from salt pork and beans and cornmeal, and the men walked the boundaries of what would become their town, discussing where to place the central square, where to site the church they planned to build, how to divide the land fairly so that each family received acreage proportional to their investment and need. The sunset that evening was spectacular, the sky going through progressions of orange and purple and deep crimson as the sun dropped toward the horizon, colors so vivid they seemed unnatural, as though the atmosphere itself had been stained by something that bled from the earth into the air. Samuel stood at the edge of one of the old wells, looking down into darkness so complete it seemed to have weight, seemed to press upward against the circle of sky visible at the top of the shaft. The well mouth was perhaps 4 feet across, the stones forming a perfect circle that descended into blackness. He could smell the water far below, a mineral scent mixed with something else, something faintly sweet and corrupt, like flowers left too long in a vase. He dropped a stone and counted, listening for the splash that came after a silence so long he almost thought the well had no bottom, that it descended into some emptiness that swallowed sound itself. When the splash finally came, it sounded wrong. Not like stone hitting water, but like stone hitting something thicker, more viscous, something that parted reluctantly and closed over the impact with a sound like a mouth closing. That night, he dreamed of water rising, of voices calling from beneath the earth, but he dismissed it as the ordinary anxiety of a man in a strange land, the mind processing the strangeness of this new territory. When he woke, the dawn was red, the sun rising through dust that turned the air the color of old blood, and he heard Martha Patterson, one of the settler women, crying near the central well. Her husband Thomas lay beside the stone rim, his body twisted in a way that suggested he had fallen, though there were no marks upon him, no blood, nothing to explain why a healthy man of 40 years should simply collapse and die in the night. They buried Thomas Patterson that afternoon, the first grave in what they grimly joked would become the town cemetery. Samuel read verses from the Bible, while the widow stood dry-eyed and silent, her 3 children clinging to her skirts. The men took turns with the shovels, breaking through caliche hardpan that resisted the blades, and when they had finished, they placed stones to mark the spot and returned to the work of building. There were houses to raise, a common store to construct, gardens to plant before the season turned. Death was common on the frontier. They had all buried people along the trail. You mourned and you continued, because stopping meant dying yourself. The second night, Samuel woke to the sound of his name. It came from outside his tent, a whisper so faint he almost convinced himself it was the wind moving through the mesquite. But then it came again, clearer, a voice that seemed to rise from the ground itself, from the well nearest to where he slept. Samuel Bridger, not a shout or a call, but a whisper intimate and terrible, as though someone stood close enough to feel their breath but remained invisible in the darkness. The voice had a quality he had never heard before, a resonance that seemed to bypass his ears entirely and speak directly to something deeper, some primitive part of his brain that recognized danger even when the conscious mind refused to accept it. Samuel Bridger. The name repeated, each syllable drawn out, savored, tasted. He lay rigid in his bedroll, his hand finding the pistol he kept loaded beside him, listening to his name repeated 3 times before silence returned. His heart hammered against his ribs with such force he thought it might wake the others sleeping nearby. Cold sweat soaked through his shirt despite the warmth of the night. He wanted to call out, to ask who was there, but some instinct kept him silent, kept him frozen and listening, aware that responding might be a mistake he would not survive. The darkness beyond his tent seemed to pulse with presence, with attention, with something that waited for him to acknowledge it, to give it permission to come closer. He counted his breaths, tried to slow his racing heart, told himself it was exhaustion, stress, the mind playing tricks in an unfamiliar place. But he knew what he had heard. He knew his name had been called from the well, knew it with the same certainty he knew that the sun would rise in the morning, that water flowed downhill, that death came for all men eventually. The question was not whether he had heard it, but what it meant, and whether acknowledging the truth of his experience would open some door that was better left closed. In the morning, he said nothing. Fear was contagious on the frontier, and a leader who showed fear could destroy a community faster than drought or hostile Indians. But at breakfast, he noticed others looked tired, circles under their eyes suggesting sleep had not come easily. People sat closer to the fires than necessary, despite the growing heat of the day. Conversations were muted, voices kept low as though afraid of being overheard by something that might be listening. Margaret Boone, a widow who had come west with her grown son, mentioned that she thought she heard singing in the night, old hymns sung in voices too numerous to count, harmonies that wove together in ways that were beautiful and wrong, that made her skin crawl even as part of her wanted to rise and join the phantom choir. Her son James dismissed it as prairie wolves, though everyone knew that wolves did not sing Amazing Grace in 4-part harmony. Dutch Hoffman admitted he had barely slept, that he kept hearing footsteps circling their wagon, the crunch of boots on gravel, though when he looked out there was never anyone there, just the empty darkness and the wind, and the sense of being watched by eyes that reflected no light. Sarah Hoffman said nothing, but Samuel noticed she would not look at the wells, kept her gaze fixed on the ground or the creek or anywhere but those stone circles that seemed to draw the eye despite all efforts to ignore them. The third day brought heat that seemed unnatural for early spring, the kind of heat that made the air shimmer and turned thinking into something sluggish and difficult. The men worked on the frame of what would become the general store while the women established gardens, breaking soil that seemed reluctant to accept seed. Samuel spent the afternoon surveying the boundaries of individual plots, driving stakes and recording measurements in his journal, trying to lose himself in the comfortable ritual of numbers and lines. But his eyes kept returning to the wells, to those dark openings in the earth that seemed to watch him with patient malevolence. That evening, as the sun dropped toward the horizon and the shadows grew long, Sarah Hoffman came running from the eastern well, her dress torn and her hands bleeding. She was 17, newly married to a farmer named Dutch who spoke more German than English, and she was screaming words that did not make immediate sense. She kept saying the well had spoken to her, that it had called her by her full name, Sarah Ann Hoffman, and then it had whispered another name, a name she would not repeat, would only weep and shake her head when they pressed her for details. They gave her whiskey and put her to bed in one of the completed cabins, and Dutch sat beside her holding her hand while she stared at the ceiling and trembled. Samuel tried to question her gently, but she would only say that the voice had been clear, that it had come from deep in the earth, that it had sounded like her grandmother who had died when Sarah was a child, but wrong somehow, the cadence off, the tone carrying something that her grandmother's voice had never held. That night, Dutch Hoffman did not wake. His wife found him cold in the morning, his hand still holding hers, his face peaceful, as though he had simply decided to stop breathing. There was no wound, no sign of violence or illness. He had been 30 years old and strong as an ox, and now he was meat growing cold in the Texas heat. They buried him beside Thomas Patterson, and this time there was less talk of God's will and more silence, the kind of silence that acknowledged something wrong but refused to name it. Samuel's journal entry from that day is brief and shaking. Second death. No cause. The men are frightened, the women more so. Dutch Hoffman heard his name from the well yesterday evening. Sarah heard it speak. Now he is dead. I do not believe in omens, but I believe in patterns. Something is very wrong with this place. On the fourth night, multiple people heard their names. Samuel woke to his name whispered 3 times, the same intimate, horrible sound rising from the well closest to his tent. Across the settlement, others woke to the same experience. Margaret Boone heard her name. Jacob Turney, a blacksmith from Tennessee. Maria Consuela Santos, a Mexican woman who had married one of the settlers. Each name whispered from the wells in the darkest hours before dawn, spoken in voices that were almost but not quite familiar, that carried tones of recognition and malice intertwined. When dawn came, they gathered at the central fire and compared experiences. 7 people had heard their names called from the wells. They argued about what to do. Some wanted to fill in the wells, to bury them deep and never speak of them again. Others pointed out they needed the water, that the creek alone could not sustain the settlement through a dry summer. A few suggested that they were all overtired, that the stress of establishing a new settlement in hostile territory was creating shared delusions, that rational men did not believe in supernatural nonsense. Samuel tried to maintain order, tried to keep the fear from spreading like cholera through the group, but he could see it in their eyes. These were people who had faced starvation and disease and the very real threat of Comanche raids. But this was different. This was something that violated the fundamental rules by which they understood the world. Wells did not speak. The dead did not reach up from the earth to call the living. Yet they had all heard it. They had all stood at the edge of those dark shafts and heard their names rising from the depths. By midday, Jacob Turney was dead. They found him beside the northern well, his body unmarked, his tools scattered around him as though he had simply set down his hammer and decided to lie down and die. His massive frame lay crumpled in the dust, one hand still reaching toward the anvil he'd been setting up, the other clutched at his chest, though there was no sign of heart failure or any other physical trauma. His eyes were open, staring at the well with an expression Samuel would never forget, a look of recognition and horror combined, as though in his final moments, Jacob had seen something that explained everything and wished desperately that he had remained ignorant. His lips were slightly parted, frozen in the act of speaking or perhaps screaming, though no one had heard any sound from him in the hours before he was discovered. He was the third to die, and the pattern was now undeniable, brutally clear in its simplicity and its horror. The wells whispered names, and those whose names were whispered did not survive until the next sunset. Some force, some presence in this valley, was selecting victims according to rules they could not comprehend, killing with a method that left no trace, no wound, nothing that could be fought or treated or understood. Panic came then, fast and absolute, spreading through the settlement like fire through dry grass. Families began packing their wagons with shaking hands, throwing possessions onto the beds without care for organization or planning, hitching teams with fingers that fumbled at buckles and straps. Children cried and asked questions their parents could not answer. Women wrapped china and silver in blankets with mechanical precision, their faces blank with shock, their movements automatic as their minds tried to process what was happening. Men loaded rifles and pistols, checking and rechecking loads as though firepower might protect them from something that killed without touching, without warning, without mercy. They would leave. They would abandon the valley, would forfeit the land grants and the dream of settlement and take their chances elsewhere, anywhere that wells remained silent, and death did not hunt with such horrible precision. Samuel tried to organize the exodus, tried to ensure that everyone would travel together, that no one would be left behind, but fear had broken the bonds of community that had held them together through months of travel and hardship. People thought only of saving themselves and their families, of putting distance between themselves and this cursed place, of running from something that could not be outrun but might at least be temporarily escaped. The cooperative spirit that had sustained them across the plains, the mutual aid and shared suffering that had forged them into a community, all of it dissolved in the face of this inexplicable terror. They reverted to isolated family units, each group focused solely on their own survival, willing to leave the weak behind if it meant gaining a few extra miles before nightfall. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, they discovered that Maria Santos was missing. Her husband Thomas found her shawl beside the eastern well, but Maria herself had vanished. They called her name, searched the surrounding brush but found nothing, and as the sun touched the western horizon, they heard her scream, a sound that rose from the well itself from impossible depths, a shriek of terror and agony that went on until it suddenly cut off, leaving silence more terrible than the screaming had been. No one slept that night. They huddled around fires built high and bright, watching the darkness beyond the light, watching the wells that stood like sentinels in the shadows. Some prayed. Others drank whiskey and held their weapons and waited for dawn. Children cried and could not be comforted. The wind moved through the mesquite with sounds that might have been words, might have been warnings, might have been the earth itself breathing. Samuel stood watch with his rifle, moving between the family groups, trying to project a confidence he did not feel. His journal from that night is barely legible, the handwriting deteriorating as fear and exhaustion took their toll. He wrote that he could hear voices from all three wells now, a constant murmuring that rose and fell like conversation, like something beneath the earth discussing the settlers with patient hunger. He wrote that he understood now why the Comanche avoided this valley, why the previous occupants had abandoned the wells and fled, leaving no record of what had driven them away. The fifth dawn came red and violent, the sky the color of infected flesh. They found two more bodies that morning. Margaret Boone lay beside the central well, her Bible open on her chest, her face peaceful despite the terror of the previous night. Young James Boone was found further out near the creek as though he had tried to run and been struck down mid-flight. Both had heard their names whispered the night before. Both had tried to stay awake, to resist whatever force was claiming them, but sleep or death or something between the two had taken them anyway. 11 people remained now, from the original 18. They abandoned any pretense of staying, of salvaging the settlement. They loaded the wagons with desperate speed, taking only what could be carried, leaving behind tools and supplies and furniture that had been dragged across half a continent. They would leave before nightfall, would put as much distance between themselves and this cursed valley as the horses could manage. But as they prepared to depart, they realized that the wells had changed. The water that had been clear and sweet now ran dark, the color of old blood or rust or something that had no name in the natural world. The surface of the water in each well rippled constantly, as though something moved beneath, as though the wells were not wells at all but throats, openings to some vast gullet that waited below the limestone and the clay. Samuel ordered them to leave the wells alone, to finish loading and mount the wagons. But curiosity or compulsion drew him to the edge of the central well, drew him to look down into those depths that had become so terrible. What he saw there, he never fully described in his journal. He wrote only that the water was not water, that shapes moved in the darkness, that faces looked up at him from the deep, faces that might have been human once but had become something else, something that waited and hungered and knew his name. They pulled out as the sun began its descent, the wagons forming a ragged line heading east, back toward the settlements, back toward civilization and safety, and the comfort of places where wells were only wells, and the earth did not speak. But they had not gone 3 miles when they heard the screaming begin behind them. Some of the families had not finished loading, had fallen behind in the rush to escape. The screams came from the direction of the valley, multiple voices raised in terror and agony, and then silence, sudden and complete. Samuel stopped his wagon, torn between the instinct to help and the knowledge that returning meant death. The others did not stop. They whipped their horses and rattled past him, racing toward the horizon, toward anywhere that was not here. He sat alone on the wagon seat listening to the silence from the valley, and then he heard his name again, carried on the wind, a whisper that seemed to come from the earth itself, from the stones and the dust and the mesquite roots that drank deep from underground waters. He drove through the night, the horses lathered and stumbling, driven beyond their endurance by his fear and his need to put distance between himself and those wells. When dawn came, he had covered perhaps 15 miles, and he allowed the animals to rest and drink from a creek that ran clear and normal, that reflected the sky and nothing else. He was alone now. The other wagons had scattered, each family choosing their own direction, their own path away from the horror they had witnessed. In the days that followed, Samuel made his way back to San Antonio, traveling alone with his remaining supplies and his memories. He reported the deaths to the authorities, told them that a fever had taken the settlement, that he was the sole survivor of a plague that had killed quickly and without mercy. They accepted his story because plague was understandable, because disease was a known killer on the frontier. because the alternative was to believe in things that rational men could not accept. But he knew the truth. He knew that the valley still waited, that the wells still whispered their prophecies to anyone foolish enough to listen, that the earth in that place had been poisoned by something older and darker than the memories of living men. He knew that names still rose from those depths, that the water still ran dark, that something beneath the limestone waited with eternal patience for the next settlers, the next dreamers, the next fools who thought they could tame a land that had never been meant for taming. His journal ends with a warning written in a hand made unsteady by whiskey and fear. Do not go to the valley where Stillwater Creek runs cold from the limestone. Do not drink from the old wells. Do not listen if you hear your name called from the darkness. The earth there remembers every death and it is not satisfied. It will never be satisfied. The wells are not wells. They are mouths, and they are hungry. But the warning was not heeded, because men forget, or because they convince themselves that the stories of previous generations are exaggerations, are the products of superstition and ignorance. In 1861, another group of settlers arrived in the valley, drawn by reports of good water and available land. They found the 3 wells still standing, the water still flowing, and they thought themselves fortunate to have discovered such a resource in this dry country. The pattern repeated itself. Names whispered in the darkness, bodies found unmarked and cold, the settlement abandoned after days of mounting horror. This cycle played out 3 more times over the following decades, each group discovering the wells, each group experiencing the same inexplicable deaths, each group fleeing in terror or dying to the last man. The final attempt at settlement came in 1882, when a cattle rancher named Elijah Stone built a ranch house beside the central well, declaring that he did not believe in ghost stories and curses, that superstition was for Mexicans and Indians and weak-minded fools who let fear control their lives. Stone was a veteran of the Civil War, had ridden with Quantrill and seen things in Kansas and Missouri that made him certain there was no horror in this world or any other that could match what men did to each other when given permission and opportunity. He had made his fortune driving cattle north to Kansas railheads, had survived stampedes and drownings and fights with rustlers, and he believed absolutely in the supremacy of will over circumstance, in the idea that a strong man could impose his vision on reality through sheer force of personality. His hired hands, Mexican vaqueros who knew the old stories, who had heard from their grandfathers about the pozos que susurran, refused to stay on the property after the sun went down. They rode to the main ranch house 5 miles east each evening and returned each morning, and they warned Stone that he was courting death, that the valley was cursed, that white men never listened until it was too late, that arrogance was no protection against forces that predated the arrival of Europeans in the New World. Stone laughed at their warnings, called them cowards and women, said he would drink from the well every day to prove there was nothing to fear but fear itself. He lived alone in his ranch house for 2 weeks, sleeping each night within sight of the central well, drinking its water with deliberate defiance, daring whatever presence might exist to show itself and face him man to man. His journal from those 2 weeks, recovered after his death, shows a gradual deterioration from confident mockery to barely concealed terror. The first entries are full of contempt for superstition and satisfaction at having the ranch to himself, free from the constant warnings and anxious looks of his vaqueros. But by the 4th day, he mentions hearing sounds at night, scratching at the walls, footsteps on the porch, his name spoken so softly he cannot be certain he actually heard it. By the 7th day, he admits to difficulty sleeping, to a sensation of being watched constantly, to finding his water bucket empty each morning though he fills it each night and lives alone. By the 10th day, his handwriting has become shaky, the entries brief and desperate, filled with references to voices calling from the well, to seeing shapes moving in the darkness beyond his windows, to the growing certainty that he has made a terrible mistake but cannot bring himself to admit defeat by abandoning the ranch. The final entry, written in letters so distorted they are barely legible, reads, "It knows my name. It has always known my name. The well is not empty. There are things in the deep places. They are patient. They are hungry. I have been marked. I hear the whispers even in daylight now. They promise things. They offer knowledge. They want me to come closer, to lean over the edge, to look down into the darkness and see what waits there. I will not. I will not. But I am so tired, and the voice is so insistent, and part of me wants to know. God forgive me. Part of me wants to see. His body was found by his vaqueros on a Monday morning, sprawled beside the well, his eyes open and staring at the sky, his face frozen in an expression of absolute terror. The well water beside him ran dark as ink, and in the dust around the stone rim, someone or something had written a single word in letters that looked like they had been traced by fingers that had no flesh remaining upon them. The word was soon. After that, the valley was abandoned permanently. The ranch was left to collapse, the wells to fill with debris and time, the entire area given over to mesquite and silence. Local ranchers graze cattle in the surrounding country, but they keep their herds away from the valley itself, and they do not camp near the old wells. Mexican families in the area still tell stories about the pozos que susurran, the wells that whisper, and they warn their children to stay away from the ruins of Stillwater Creek. In recent years, hikers and paranormal investigators have tried to locate the valley, following descriptions from old journals and land records, but the exact location has become difficult to pinpoint. Some claim to have found the wells, to have heard voices rising from the depths, to have experienced the same mounting dread that Samuel Bridger described in his journal. Others dismiss these accounts as imagination and suggestion, as people scared by their own shadows and the power of old stories. But there are certain facts that remain difficult to explain. In the county records, there are gaps in the land grants from the 1850s, parcels that were claimed and then immediately abandoned, entries that simply stop without explanation. In the local cemetery outside San Antonio, there are several graves from that period marked only with the word unknown, bodies recovered from the frontier and buried without identification, without explanation of how they died. And there are the testimonies of people who have ventured into the backcountry west of San Antonio, into the valleys where Stillwater Creek still flows cold and clear from its limestone source. They speak of finding old wells in impossible locations, wells that seem to move or appear where no wells should be, wells that whisper if you stand at the rim and listen in the hours before dawn. They speak of hearing their names called from the darkness, of feeling compelled to lean closer, to listen more carefully, to try to understand what the voices are saying. Some of these people come back changed, haunted by the experience, unable to sleep without hearing whispers, unable to drink water without remembering the sound of their name rising from impossible depths. Others do not come back at all. Search parties find their camps abandoned, their supplies scattered, their vehicles left running with the doors open, as though the occupants had fled in sudden terror or been taken by something that left no trace. The last documented case occurred in 2003, when a geological survey team from Austin was mapping water sources in the region as part of an aquifer preservation study. The team consisted of 5 members, all trained geologists and hydrologists, all armed with scientific instruments and the confidence that comes from advanced degrees and peer-reviewed methodologies. They were mapping limestone formations and underground water channels, using ground-penetrating radar and seismic surveys to create detailed models of the subsurface hydrology. 3 members of the team reported hearing voices from an old well they discovered while doing fieldwork in a valley that matched descriptions from historical accounts, though none of them had read those accounts or knew the history of Stillwater Creek. They described the experience in clinical language, trying to maintain professional detachment even as their reports revealed underlying unease. The voices were described as multiple, overlapping, speaking in what seemed to be English, though the words could not be clearly distinguished. They recorded the sounds using high-quality audio equipment, capturing several minutes of what they described as whispers and murmuring that seemed to rise from deep within the well, sounds that did not match any known geological or atmospheric phenomenon. The recording itself is difficult to analyze, the audio so degraded and distorted that nothing clear can be extracted from it. Multiple audio engineers have attempted to clean up the recording, to filter out noise and isolate the voices, but the result is always the same: a murky soup of sounds that seems to actively resist analysis, that degrades further with each attempt to clarify it, as though whatever was captured does not want to be understood or examined. The 3 team members who heard the voices all reported the same progression of symptoms in the weeks following their return from the field. First came the insomnia, an inability to sleep more than a few hours without waking from dreams they could not remember, but which left them sweating and terrified. Then came the auditory hallucinations, hearing their names whispered in empty rooms, in the shower, while driving alone in their cars. They each sought medical attention, were prescribed anti-anxiety medications and sleeping pills, were referred to therapists who diagnosed stress and overwork and suggested vacation time. None of the doctors they consulted knew about the well or the recordings or the history of the valley, where they had conducted their fieldwork. 2 weeks after returning from the field, one member of the team, a geologist named Rachel Morrison, died in her sleep. She was 35 years old in excellent health, a marathon runner who had completed her last physical exam with perfect results just 3 months prior. The autopsy found no cause of death, no disease or injury or explanation for why a healthy 35-year-old woman should simply stop breathing in the night. Her heart showed no abnormalities. Her lungs were clear. Her blood chemistry was normal. The pathologist wrote sudden unexplained death in adults on the death certificate, a medical euphemism for, "We have no idea what killed this person, but we need to put something in the appropriate box." Her apartment was found in a state of chaos, furniture pushed against the walls, every mirror in the place covered with sheets or turned to face the wall, her windows sealed with duct tape despite the summer heat. On her bathroom mirror, written in soap, were the words, "It knows my name." The other 2 team members who had heard the voices both reported experiencing nightmares that continued for months after Rachel's death. Dreams so vivid and terrible they began to dread sleep, began using caffeine and amphetamines to stay awake as long as possible. They described dreams of falling into darkness, of water that was not water, of voices calling their names with patient insistence, of seeing faces in the deep that were almost human but not quite, that had too many eyes or mouths that opened too wide, or skin that rippled like disturbed water. Both eventually sought treatment for severe anxiety and post-traumatic stress. Both left the Geological Survey and found work in other fields, urban planning and environmental consulting, positions that kept them in cities and far from any field work that might take them into the backcountry. Neither will discuss the incident on record, both having signed non-disclosure agreements with the university that employed them, agreements that were presented as routine bureaucratic necessity, but which effectively silenced them about their experiences. The survey project was quietly discontinued. The recordings were filed away in a university archive where they remain, along with hundreds of other unexplained phenomena that science cannot adequately address. The area where the team worked is no longer included in geological surveys. The maps show it as empty space, a blank region between known landmarks, as though even cartography has learned to avoid certain places. But the wells remain. Whether they are the same wells that Samuel Bridger described in 1854, or whether they are new manifestations of the same phenomenon, no one can say with certainty. The earth in that part of Texas is riddled with limestone caves and underground water systems, vast networks of channels and caverns that have never been fully mapped or explored. What might exist in those depths, what might have made its home in the darkness beneath the surface, is a question that few are willing to seriously consider. There are theories, of course. Some point to Native American legends about the region, stories of sacred wells and spirits that guarded water sources, tales of punishments for those who disturbed holy places. The Tonkawa people, who lived in the region before being displaced by European settlement, had oral traditions about certain springs and wells that were forbidden, places where the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead grew thin, where water that looked pure was actually poisoned by proximity to the underworld. Their medicine men spoke of water spirits that could take the form of human voices, that called people to their deaths, not out of malice but as part of some cosmic balance, some mechanism by which the earth reclaimed what had been taken from it. These traditions were dismissed by early settlers as primitive superstition, the imaginings of savages who could not distinguish between natural phenomena and supernatural causation. But the Tonkawa avoided those valleys, marked them as forbidden territory, and punished with exile any member of the tribe who ventured into the cursed places. Their knowledge was accumulated over generations, paid for in lives and inscribed in stories that served as warning and wisdom both. The Comanche, who later dominated the region, had similar prohibitions. They called the wells Los Ojos del Infierno, the eyes of hell, borrowing Spanish vocabulary to describe something for which their own language had words too sacred or too dangerous to speak aloud. Comanche raiders who pursued enemies into the forbidden valleys would halt at the boundaries, would refuse to follow no matter how close the prey or how valuable the potential plunder. They said that the water in those places was jealous, that it demanded tribute and blood, that it would take from anyone who drank from it or built near it or claimed ownership of land that had never belonged to the living. Stories passed down through Comanche families speak of warriors who ignored the warnings, who pursued Apache or Mexican raiders into the cursed valleys and were never seen again, or were found days later, wandering mindless and unable to speak, their hair turned white and their eyes seeing things that others could not perceive. Others suggest that something in the geological formation creates acoustic phenomena, that wind and water moving through caverns can produce sounds that seem like voices, that the human mind, primed by fear and isolation, interprets these natural sounds as meaningful speech. Limestone regions are known for unusual acoustic properties, for caves that amplify whispers and chambers that create resonances at frequencies that trigger primal fear responses in mammals. The infrasound generated by certain geological formations can cause feelings of dread, visual hallucinations, and even physical symptoms like rapid heartbeat and difficulty breathing. Scientists who favor naturalistic explanations point to these phenomena, to the power of suggestion, to the ways that stress and lack of sleep can create shared delusions in isolated groups. They argue that the deaths can be explained by natural causes, by heart conditions triggered by stress, by accidents misinterpreted as supernatural intervention, by the brain's tendency to find patterns even in random events. But these theories do not explain the deaths, not really. Not in any way that satisfies the need for genuine understanding. They do not explain why people whose names are whispered from the wells die before morning, with such regularity that the pattern holds across a century and a half of documented cases. They do not explain why the pattern has repeated itself consistently, whether the witnesses were illiterate frontier settlers or trained scientists with recording equipment and peer-reviewed methodologies. They do not explain why the water sometimes runs dark when tested. It shows no unusual chemical composition, why those who drink from the wells report tasting something bitter and wrong, even when analysis reveals nothing but normal minerals and trace elements, nothing that would account for the flavor or the effects. They do not explain the handwriting in dust, the words written beside bodies, the journals filled with progressive descent into terror by people who began as skeptics and died as believers. They do not explain why Samuel Bridger, 30 years after leaving the valley, heard the whispers again in his home in San Antonio and died with recognition on his face, as though something he thought he had escaped had finally caught up with him. The truth, if there is a truth, may be simpler and more terrible than any theory. Perhaps there are places where the boundary between the living world and whatever lies beneath or beyond is thin, places where something hungry and patient can reach through given the right conditions. Perhaps the wells are not wells at all, but openings, portals, throats leading to dimensions or spaces that human understanding cannot encompass. Perhaps the voices are exactly what they seem to be, the voices of something that knows our names, that has always known our names, that waits in the darkness beneath the earth for the chance to call us home. Samuel Bridger lived for 30 more years after his experience at Stillwater Creek. He never returned to the valley, never spoke publicly about what happened there, kept his journal hidden until shortly before his death, when he gave it to a cousin with instructions that it should be preserved as a warning. He died in 1884, at the age of 62, of what the death certificate called natural causes. But those who found his body noted that he had been writing in his journal when death took him, that his pen had fallen from his hand mid-sentence, that his face bore an expression of recognition, as though he had looked up from his writing and seen something or someone standing in the room with him. The last entry in his journal, written in a hand that grew increasingly shaky as the words progressed, read simply this: "I hear the whispers again. After all these years, I hear them. They have found me, they remember. The wells never forget, the earth never forgets. It knows my name, it has always known my name, and now it is calling me home." Below that, in letters that barely qualify as handwriting, so distorted and desperate that they are difficult to read, he wrote one final word, repeated 3 times as though it were a prayer or a curse, or simply the last thought of a dying man who had spent 3 decades trying to forget what he had seen and heard in a cursed valley in the heart of Texas. The word was, listen. The wells at Stillwater Creek still stand, or perhaps new wells appear in that valley with each generation, manifestations of something that has been there longer than human memory, longer than recorded history. The land gives up its secrets slowly, and some secrets are never meant to be fully revealed, only glimpsed at the edges of understanding, in the moments before sleep, in the hours before dawn when the darkness is deepest and the barriers between worlds grow thin. There are people who claim to have heard the wells whispering in recent years, who say that if you travel to the right valley at the right time, if you find the old stone-lined shafts hidden among the mesquite and the prickly pear, you can hear voices rising from the depths. They say the voices are clearer now than they were in Samuel Bridger's time, that whatever speaks from those dark places has grown stronger or bolder, that it no longer confines itself to the hours before dawn, but can be heard at any time if you listen carefully enough. They say the voices know things they should not know, that they speak in the accents of people long dead, that they can describe events that have not yet happened but will, that they offer knowledge and secrets to those brave enough or foolish enough to lean close and listen. They say that some people who hear the voices become obsessed with returning, that they make pilgrimages to the valley again and again, drawn by compulsion they cannot resist or explain, that they spend hours at the rim of the wells listening to whispers that gradually drive them mad. And they say that eventually, inevitably, these people hear their names called from the darkness, and when they do, their time is measured in hours, that they can feel death approaching like a cold wind, that they know with absolute certainty that they will not survive to see another sunrise. Some try to run, some try to fight, some simply wait, accepting what is coming with the resignation of those who understand that certain things cannot be escaped, that certain debts must be paid, that the earth claims what the earth is owed. The frontier has been tamed, or so we tell ourselves. The wild places have been mapped and surveyed and brought under the rule of law and reason. We have explained away the mysteries, have reduced the supernatural to psychology and geology, and the misinterpretation of natural phenomena. We have convinced ourselves that the world operates according to rules we understand, that there is nothing in the darkness that cannot be illuminated by science and rationality. But there are still places where the old rules apply, where the earth remembers what we have chosen to forget, where the water runs deep and dark and speaks with voices that should not exist. There are still wells in Texas that whisper names to those who listen, and those names are prophecies, pronouncements of death that come with the certainty of Scripture and the weight of natural law. If you should find yourself in the back country west of San Antonio, if you should come across old stone-lined wells in a valley where Stillwater Creek runs cold and clear, do not stop to rest beside them. Do not drink from their waters, no matter how pure they may appear. And above all, do not lean close and listen in the quiet hours. Do not try to decipher what the darkness is saying. Do not allow yourself to wonder whether that sound is only the wind or whether it might be something else, something older and hungrier and infinitely patient. Because if you hear your name rising from those depths, if you hear it spoken in a voice that is almost but not quite familiar, if you hear it whispered 3 times in the hours before dawn, then you are marked. The wells have claimed you, the earth has called you, and before the sun rises again you will answer that call, one way or another, whether you believe in curses and spirits and the persistence of evil, or whether you trust in reason and science and the comforting fiction that the world is exactly what it appears to be. The wells that whisper the names of those who would die by morning are still there, still waiting, still hungry. The earth is patient. The darkness is eternal. And somewhere in the limestone depths beneath the Texas soil, voices continue their ancient work, cataloging the living, pronouncing judgment, calling names into the void, and waiting for the inevitable answer. Some frontiers were never meant to be crossed. Some waters were never meant to be drunk. Some voices were never meant to be heard. And some names once spoken by the darkness can never be unspoken, can never be taken back, can never be anything but prophecy fulfilled when the sun fails to rise for those who have been chosen, those who have been marked, those who have heard their names whispered from the depths, and learned too late that certain knowledge carries a price that can only be paid with blood and breath, and the final surrendering of light to the darkness that has always waited below.